Welcome to New Perspectives on Integral and Transformational Learning, sponsored by Aro University in Surat, India, and hosted by sister organizations Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center in Surat, India, and here in South Carolina, USA. Through collaborative efforts such as New Perspectives, it is the hope of these organizations and the founder, H.P. Rama, to assist in building a bridge between the East and West. In his message to America in 1949, Sri Aurobindo emphasizes the necessity for unity and oneness between the East and West, where he says, quote, "East and West have the same human nature, a common human destiny, the same aspiration after a greater perfection, the same seeking after something higher than itself, something towards which inwardly and even outwardly we move. East and West could be reconciled in the pursuit of the highest and largest ideal. Spirit embraced matter, and matter find its own true reality and the hidden reality in all things in the spirit." New Perspectives is a platform for the exploration of contemporary topics and current events of global events. As a beacon of light, the integral yoga teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother serves as guidance, inspiration, and insight as we seek to unravel and comprehend the deeper significance of present-day affairs and examine critical issues of our time. Its aim is to facilitate presentations and interactions of the various experts and researchers in diverse fields of endeavor in order to create a common, cross-cultural, interdisciplinary, and interactive platform where all perspectives find their true place, leading to a more harmonious and comprehensive ways of living. New Perspectives is launched on this very special day in America, Independence Day. On July 4th, 1776, delegates from all 13 colonies adopted the Declaration of Independence, which proclaims, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." To commemorate the centennial of the American Declaration of Independence, France commissioned the design of a sculpture, which they named Liberty Enlightening the World, now known as the Statue of Liberty. Installed on Liberty Island in 1886, its significance grew as an inspiration to immigrants who sailed past Lady Liberty on their way to America. These same high ideals that we find in America's Declaration of Independence have been echoed throughout history by other nations. In 1789, France proclaimed its Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen that, quote, "Men are born and remain free and are equal in rights." In 1949, India vows in its constitution to secure to all citizens justice, liberty, and equality, and to promote among them all fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual and unity and integrity of the nation. And most recently, in 2014, Tunisian Constitution of the Republic pledged to create, quote, "a political system that guarantees respect for human rights and freedoms, equality of rights and duties between all citizens, men and women, and equality between all regions." Nearly 250 years after its Declaration of Independence, America struggles to live up to its grand yet imminent ideals. Recent social crusades confirm the vast gap between the ideal that all men are created equal and today's reality. Such crusades include Fair Immigration Reform Movement, FIRM, Freedom in Sexual Orientation, LGBTQ, the Me Too movement, and Black Lives Matter, with its current slogan, "I Can't Breathe," ignited by the recent death of George Floyd. It is evident that America must continue in earnest its efforts to bridge the meaning of the words in its Declaration of Independence with the realities of our time. But America is not alone. No nation has yet to secure such fundamental rights to its citizens as equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A telling sign that new social structures are critically needed. Now is the time to sow the seeds for the next great step in human's evolution. The progression from what Sri Aurobindo referred to as the individualistic age to that of the subjective age, one founded upon deeper spiritual understandings of ourselves and the world. In the human cycle, Sri Aurobindo proclaims that as we near the subjective age, quote, discoveries will be made that thin the walls between the soul and matter. Attempts there will be to extend knowledge into the psychological and psychic realms, but with a realization of the truth that these have laws of their own, which are other than physical, but not the less laws just because they escape the external senses. For these laws are infinitely plastic and subtle. Today, our panelists will discuss the timely topic, the emergence of a new social structure in the light of Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. Vladimir Yatsenko with the Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center here in Fountain Inn, South Carolina, will serve as moderator. He is a scholar and instructor of Sanskrit and Sanskrit language, and a researcher in Vedic and Vedantic studies. I'll turn it over to you, Vladimir, now to introduce our esteemed panelists and moderate our new perspective discussion, the emergence of a new social order.
Thank you. Thank you, Radhim. Welcome to this panel discussion and to this webinar on a new social order, on emergence of a new social order. And we have with us two speakers, well known in their fields of research. First will be Devdip Ganguli, who is the resident, full-time resident in Sri Aurobindo Ashram, who grew up in the Sri Aurobindo International Center of Education in this ashram and completed his studies in 2004. And from that time on, he was offering courses on the history, art, culture of India, as well as the social and political thought of Sri Aurobindo in the ashram school. And second speaker will be Rod Hemsell, who is an educator and the author who lived in Auroville and Sri Aurobindo Ashram since 1968. He initiated many different projects at different schools in Colorado, in Auroville, and was in Auroville participating in, and he is the founder of the University of Human Unity since 2007 and lectured there till 2017 on different topics on the philosophy of religion, a philosophy of evolution in the light of Sri Aurobindo. So these two eminent speakers will enlighten us and bring these to us this important discussion, what is happening in the world today, because we are all very interested what is going to happen to us. We could see that there is this shift of paradigm is taking place. And as we mentioned in our brief, that we would address these two paradigms as a paradigm of inevitability and eternity, from the book of Timothy Snyder, The Road to Unfreedom. And another great topic, why nationalist tendencies, why nationalism, by the Yale Tamir, where she views these tendencies from the positive point of view. All this we would like to look into from the perspective of Sri Aurobindo's psychology of social development, especially the human cycle and the ideal of human unity. So before I give the microphone to Devdip, I would like to bring forward some ideas of Sri Aurobindo, just to give a tone to the whole discussion, to the whole webinar. Nothing is more obscure to humanity or less seized by its understanding, says Sri Aurobindo at the beginning of the ideal of human unity, than its own communal and collective life. Nothing is more obscure to humanity or less seized by its understanding, whether in the power that moves it or the sense of the aim towards which it moves, than its own communal and collective life. Sociology does not help us, for it only gives us the general story of the past and the external conditions under which communities have survived. History teaches us nothing. It is a confused torrent of events and personalities, or kaleidoscope of changing institutions. We do not seize the real sense of all this change and this continual streaming forward of human life in the channels of time. This is the beginning of the ideal of human unity, which is the fundamental work of Sri Aurobindo in this regard, in the social science. And there he presents immediately the beginning of the individualistic age. Individualistic age of humanity, of human society, comes as a result of the corruption and failure of the conventional age, as a revolt against the reign of the petrified typal figure. So before the individualist age, which started with the Renaissance in Europe, which was inspired by Greek philosophy and reforms in Christian church, Protestant movements. The beginning of this individualist age was a revolt against the conventions which already were petrified and didn't have any meaning and could not inspire individuals to live. So individualism of the new age, says Sri Aurobindo, is an attempt to get back from the conventionalism of belief and practice to some solid bedrock, no matter what, of real and tangible truth. And it is necessarily individualistic because all the old general standards have become bankrupt and can no longer give any inner help. It is therefore the individual who has to become a discoverer, a pioneer, and to search out by his individual reason, intuition, idealism, desire, claim upon life, or whatever other light he finds in himself, the true law of the world and of his own being. So this was a necessity. But what is interesting in his examination is that this attempt to build up the truth and to discover it in the individual terms led finally to the discovery of science. So the attempt to govern and organize human life by verifiable science, by a law, a truth of things, an order and principles which all can observe and verify in their ground and fact, and to which, therefore, all may freely and must rationally subscribe, is the culminating movement of European civilization. So it's a discovery of law, which is applicable to all individuals, where all can be equal. So it starts with liberty and moves to equality. And it has been the fulfillment and triumph of individualistic age of human society. It has seemed likely also to be its end. For this discovery by individual free thought of universal laws, of which the individual is almost a byproduct, and by which he must necessarily be governed. This attempt actually to govern the social life of humanity in conscious accordance with the mechanism of these laws seems to lead logically to the suppression of that very individual freedom, which made the discovery and the attempt at all possible. In seeking the truth and law of his own being, the individual seems to have discovered a truth and law which is not of his own individual being at all, but of the collectivity, the pack, the hive, the mass. The result to which this point, and to which it still seems irresistibly to be driving us, is the new ordering of society by a rigid economic or governmental socialism, in which the individual, deprived again of his freedom in his own interest and that of humanity, must have his whole life and action determined for him at every step and in every point, from birth to old age, by the well-ordered mechanism of the state. Now, I think it is essentially describing the whole process of this individualist age and the necessity of the subjective one, which is emerging now. And we are exactly on this threshold, crossing from one age to another. And that is the major topic of our discussion today. And he gives also in the footnote a very interesting remark. We already see a violent, though incomplete, beginning of this line of social evolution in fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, communist Russia. The trend is for more and more nations to accept this beginning of a new order. And the resistance of the old order, the old conventional age, which individualist age got rid of, is more passive than active. It lacks the fire, enthusiasm, and self-confidence, which animates the innovating idea. It is incapable to help anymore, to stop this movement. So on this kind of note, I would like to give the microphone to Devdip and to present us with the ideas of Sri Aurobindo in this regard. Yes, Devdip.
So thank you, Radha, for the introduction and the passage that you read from the Declaration of Independence. Always very inspiring. Vladimir, thank you for your introduction as well, for your opening remarks. Much of the later part of the passage that you read from Sri Aurobindo the events played themselves out in the 20th century. When he was writing those comments in the second decade of the 20th century, and in fact, it's remarkable to see how subsequent decades would show how many of those ideas would have to go through a full cycle of development and ultimately rejection with the passage of the Second World War and so on. So Sri Aurobindo's social and political perspective, philosophy, really touches upon many points, and in many ways to speak of a new social structure or social order, it's misplaced. I think it's better to speak about, because this form or the structure or the order is really secondary in Sri Aurobindo's perspective. It is not so much a new social order or form or structure that will emerge as much as the change of approach, understanding, consciousness, which will dictate a form that is relevant to its time. And so what is that perspective or attitude with which Sri Aurobindo looks at the development of human societies and collectivities? That's what I think I would like to speak about briefly, touch upon a few of the important ideas that he presents in the human cycle and the ideal of human unity. So to begin with, of course, we have to start with a view which is as cosmic and universal as possible. So we stand back from the present moment, from the time that we live in, and we try to see the broad span of history. And we begin right with the earliest human groups. And we see that human aggregates have developed over millennia. We are so used to the world that we live in that we tend to think it was always like that. And even if we know through our history classes that in fact the nation state is a new concept and it's just a few centuries old, but still it feels as if it has always been there because it is such a reality of our times. But in fact, the nation state is something which has developed over centuries. There's been a very long process to arrive at it. And so when we see the development of human aggregates, we begin with the tribe, the family unit, the commune, larger and larger aggregates which grew with the passage of time. And this process is extremely slow. What is interesting is that each subsequent structure combines or overlaps the other, a bit like an onion. So you have individuals who identified with the family unit, who also identified with the community or the tribe that they lived in or were a part of. They also identified with the city-state or the smaller monarchical state that they lived with. And so these aggregates grew in complexity, in form, and each layer added on top of the previous one. And so we come straight away to an interesting idea which runs across Sri Aurobindo's writings on social and political philosophy, which is namely that there seem to be two trends in nature which are constantly trying to balance each other out, namely the compulsion of the individual to manifest their individuality and the compulsion of the aggregate or the collectivity to hold the individuals together, giving them some kind of identity. So there is a slow process, a development of identities which is taking place, and the individual and the collective are sort of playing out one with the other. So when we look at, for example, an interesting thing happens roughly around 500 BC it's hard to put dates to these things, but say roughly in the first millennium BC, particularly after 600 BCE, we see an interesting phenomena taking place around the world. So we have the Greek city-states. For example, Sri Aurobindo often uses the example of Greece and Rome to reflect this idea, this conflict between the individual and the group. And so you have the Greek city-states of Athens and Corinth and Syracuse and so on, Sparta, which are independent units which share some common trend of culture and identity, but which are not politically united, and which are hubs of creativity and innovation, to use a modern term, but really hubs of exploration of human consciousness and the world of nature and the world around us. And on the other hand, you have a movement for trying to combine these city-states into some kind of a common group. And much later, of course, you have the Roman Empire, which eventually conquers the Greek city-states and makes them a part of the Roman Empire. Similarly, in India, you have the period of the Mahajanapadas, where you have Magad, Anga, Avanti, uh, Kuru, Kosala, number of these small sort of republics, not republics in the modern sense, but still republics because they may have had monarchies, but the structures were much more democratic, understood in the wider sense of the term. And this was a time, again, in the Ideal of Humanity, Sri Aurobindo refers to this period as one of the most productive and culturally interesting times in Indian history, because this is when the philosophies, numerous philosophies are being explored. This is when numerous developments take place in culture, in art, in religion, in various other fields. And again, 200-300 years later, around the second century BCE, you have a movement to try and combine all these different units together under the Mauryan Empire. Again, a third example, if you look at China, you have a similar movement which is taking place. You have the Warring States period, you have the Wu state, the Wei state, all the 5 or 6 different states which are constantly fighting each other, but it's also a very productive time from the cultural point of view. And then later you have the Qin dynasty, which comes and unites all these states together. So in other words, what the point we are starting with is that there is a tendency in nature to, like a seesaw, we move from diverse group, a lot of different creative expression through separate units. And on the other hand, we have some kind of a structure which seeks to combine all of them together and keep them together and force them to be together. What is the advantage of the smaller separate units? It's growth and diversity, creativity. Human progress takes place when there is the possibility of individual expression. What is the advantage of the empire units? Stability and peace. So, for example, the Roman Empire gave us centuries of stability and peace. Relatively, everything is relative always, but relative to the period before it, much more peace and stability within the Roman Empire than what was there in the preceding period among the Greek city-states always fighting each other. Similarly, with the Mauryan Empire in India and the Qin state in China. Now, the point is that the empire was you can say a primitive or early form of nature trying to create unity by imposition and force. But the problem with empires always is that they tend to centralize, they draw life from the constituent elements, and it leads to stagnation and ultimately the death of the empire. No empire has survived beyond a few centuries. They always tend to break up once again into separate states. So this is where the nation comes in. Because why the nation form is so interesting is that it is able to combine these two disparate elements into one political structure that can sustain both the need of the individual to express their own diversity and individuality, as well as the need of the group to form some kind of cohesive unit. So the nation creates a unit which is both respects the individual and the diversity of the group, as well as protects and unites and gives some sort of stability to the larger form. So through the ideal of human unity, especially in the second part of the book, Sri Aurobindo spends a lot of time discussing how has the nation state formed? What are the steps that it takes? And I don't want my opening remarks to be too long, so I will just sort of present a summary of that idea. Broadly speaking, the nation state, the nation develops through 3 stages. The first stage is there has to be some kind of common element binding together the different units. So take, for example, in India, you had the Mahajana Padas. These were separate. They were ruled separately. They were fighting with each other politically. And yet, underlying them, there was a kind of cultural, psychological unity that was holding them together. They saw themselves as similar, but not politically one. But there was some common thread which bound all these different elements together. And then in the second stage of the nation building period, you had some centralizing force or agency. And different countries had different centralizing agencies. In some cases, it was internal. If you take the case of China, they had subsequent, again with China, it was a seesaw. You had a period of strong centralization, bringing everything together, and then once again it would break away, and you would have lots of conflicts and lack of peace in the empire. In the case of Europe, in Western Europe, the Roman Empire, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, each country had its own story. We don't have the time to go into it. In the case of India, that political centralizing power was the British. Sri Aurobindo uses an interesting image. He says the British were like the Deus Ex Machina in the context of India. Deus Ex Machina, a reference to Greek tragedies, where the hero would kind of descend on a machine which somebody would operate. So the god descending on the machine, like even if you read Sri Aurobindo's play Perseus the Deliverer, uses the same dramatic element. He comes down and he resolves the problem when it seems impossible to resolve. And so with India, it was similar. A lot of efforts, internal efforts to arrive at national political unity, but always so many difficulties, so many problems, many attempts, until you had colonial rule, which forced all these elements to come together under a strong national identity. And so there is a certain mechanical element to this movement of creating the nation, because that the second phase, the centralization, is crucial for the creation of the nation state. And as we mentioned earlier, what does the nation state do? It is able to sustain a lot of diversity within a broad framework of unity, political unity. Now, when we talk about internationalism, when we talk about world union and world unity, the problem is, assuming that it has to go through or pass through similar process, we will be stuck with the second phase. So allow me to explain what I mean. Even if we have a strong sentiment of world union, which I think we will all agree, in some form or the other, has been growing over the last 100 years. It has had its ups and downs, but broadly, we have more and more a sense of global, what shall we say, commonality, notwithstanding the many problems that exist, but more and more people recognize that we are all connected with each other. And certainly within the continents, there has been some success, like the European Union and the African Union, not so much in Asia, unfortunately, but still there is a recognition of the need for creating larger groups. And somehow the United Nations itself is a symbol of human unity. But the challenge of creating any formal international structure through mechanical means is for the earth to pass through a centralizing stage. And that is very difficult for us to conceive at this point of time, because you had colonial rule in India, or you had a strong dynasty in France, which forced all the constituent elements to come together. How do we see it happening in the context of the whole world? Can there possibly be a world empire? It seems very unlikely and extremely difficult to achieve. Perhaps 100 years ago, but now increasingly impossible to conceive. So the point is that the only way that we can understand human unity, and I'll end with this thought and then open it to broader discussions, and then Rod can come in. When we speak about human unity, we must understand that we must not conflate it with uniformity. So human unity and uniformity are two different things. Unity does not mean to create an aggregate, a collective structure where everyone is the same, or feels the same, believes the same way, or thinks in the same way. This idea of unity is not compatible with our understanding of human consciousness. Unity in the true sense of the word is an underlying sense of oneness, which is able to sustain diverse expressions, which is able to sustain diverse cultures. And so I end with a crucial idea in both the human cycle and the ideal of human unity, namely that the only way that you can arrive at a lasting human unity is if we are able to station that unity, if we are able to base that unity at the foundation of the spirit. Because the spirit, in our understanding of the spirit, as we don't have the time to explore this idea, but I'll just put it out there and then we can talk about it. Our understanding of the spirit is that it is one and many at the same time. The way the Upanishads, the way Indian philosophies, the way diverse philosophies around the world even have understood the deepest layer of our personality is such that we can be united at that layer even while remaining open to diverse expressions. And so, to end my comments, we see a development of human aggregates from small aggregates to larger and larger aggregates, and we've arrived at the nation through a certain process which is very unlikely to be replicated at the level of the world. If we truly want to move towards human unity, it is not enough to create structures and arrive at human unity through external means alone. I'm not discounting the importance of those external structures. And certainly they play an important role. But ultimately, human unity has to be based on a deeper experience and realization of something which is more fundamental.
Thank you, Devdip. Beautiful. And very good on timing, earlier than necessary, yes, within 20 minutes. Of course, these ideas are so profound, and the whole development of the social structures. And our topic was that we are on the edge, we are leaving the one paradigm and moving into another, which is more, how to say, suppressing the individual in some way by economic laws, by regulations. We can see this tendency everywhere. In India, in US, in Europe, it becomes more and more law-oriented, and how you have to behave. There are many papers to fill in, many applications to fill in, and so on and so forth. So individuals, at the same time, there is this unifying movement is taking place, and at the same time, we have this reaction of the state. That's why I quoted from Human Cycle, because I think it is from the first two chapters, it is totally clear to Sri Aurobindo. Then the search, the individual freedom, which leads to the discoveries of laws of nature, and establishing those laws becomes in itself contrary to the movement of the freedom of the individual. So he discovers the laws applicable to all individuals, and from now on, he suppresses his own individual freedom. And this is what is happening. That's why we are speaking about the two paradigms, shift from the inevitability, which was more oriented towards liberalism and search for the individual freedom, towards this eternity paradigm where state is not in charge anymore of any individual freedom, cannot provide it. It's not interested to do it. It is interested only to maintain that equality or that kind of security against some threat. Threats are becoming very important in these paradigms. So it's kind of a reaction. That very reaction, it's, as Sri Aurobindo says in this footnote here, we already see a violent, though incomplete beginning of this line. Then that is Nazis and communism and so on. These are beginnings. It is continuing in another form, this reaction, how to keep up the individual within the social framework. And this is something we wanted to see, and how to come out from this kind of crisis. So I'm kind of readdressing this question to you again, and to Rod, of course, to reflect upon this. Before we give a microphone to Rod to deliver his. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. So I think one way of understanding this whole, to discuss this paradigm is to think about the three terms that emerged from the French Revolution. So liberty, equality, and fraternity. And to relate these terms once again to this deeper understanding of the progression of nature. So liberty corresponds, as is obvious, to this strong sense of individual expression, of wanting to manifest one's true identity and sense in every field and form possible. Equality corresponds to this deeper urge in us for oneness, of connecting at some level to each other, where we are at that level the same. Though, of course, one of the many distortions that take place in human things is that we equate equality once again with being the same, as we discussed earlier. And we make the mistake of confusing liberty with doing whatever one wants rather than manifesting what one is. And the third term, which is often forgotten in most political, social, political, philosophical discussions, is fraternity. And perhaps a better word which explains the same idea is this fraternity really corresponds to that thing which unites all of us. That's something deeper, which the sense of brotherhood is not enough. It is something which is more fundamental. And that something more fundamental can sustain both liberty and equality. So to address your question directly, what we see in the world really is a constant trend of these two trends manifesting themselves. And so you have states and governments which would like to enforce more on the individual, and you have the individual, of course, who would like more liberty. And interestingly, both would like to manifest something which is true but distorted in our expression. So when we speak of a new social order, the only meaningful way to think about it is to understand that any mental paradigm that we come up with can only have a temporary expediency. It can serve a certain need of the moment, but ultimately each of these mental paradigms are intrinsically inhibited because of the fact that they are focusing on some one aspect of the triune truth of liberty, equality, and inner oneness. And so when we speak of communism, it again is a distortion of that fundamental truth of equality. When we speak of democracy and wanting to be, independent, again, very often it can become a distortion of liberty. And similarly, fraternity, when it's not deep enough, it reflects in popular culture, and those are all positive, encouraging signs, but it's not enough to really have a grounding of human unity. A smallest incident, the smallest problems can shake that feeling of unity very quickly.
Wonderful, thank you. Rod, would you like to make a reflection on these topics, or you would like to go straight to your topic, to your presentation? You have to unmute yourself. I can unmute you if you want me to.
Good. Now can you hear me?
Did. Yes.
Well, there is no difference between commenting on this topic and my planned presentation. It's possible to quote from Sri Aurobindo forever because he was able to write about everything. And yet, these concepts that are being discussed exist within a framework or a system of understanding. And every philosophy has a system whereby it understands whatever it is that it wants to understand. And the challenge for us, one of the big challenges for us as being proponents of Sri Aurobindo's system of understanding is, I think, to relate that system to the world as it exists. There's a difference between the world as it exists and any system of understanding. And so when we speak about these ideas of unity and the inner oneness as opposed to the idea of fraternity, we have to realize that this concept of inner oneness is a spiritual concept, and this idea of fraternity is a social and political concept. And the problems in the world are of that latter nature. Sri Aurobindo in the Synthesis of Yoga makes a distinction between the two realities. There are two realities, he says. There's the reality of the eternal divine truth and the soul that can achieve oneness with it. And there's the reality of the space-time continuum of evolution in which human societies develop, in which science develops. And he consequently says there are two evolutions. There's the spiritual evolution, whereby the soul is attempting to achieve oneness with the higher self. And there is the evolution of ideas and principles that emerge in human society as a result of cellular development in the organism. And so these are two evolutions and two realities. And Sri Aurobindo has stressed the importance of making the distinction. So I think we also need to make that distinction. That's my comment on the topic.
All right. Yes.
Yeah, I just have one idea to share to Rod's, or just one comment, and then we can move on to the next thing that you have in mind, Vladimir. I agree with what Rod says in that a distinction has to be made between the two realities. But I also think it's very important to move towards this perception that the two that if we are truly seeking for a resolution of the many problems of human existence and consciousness, our understanding of the two realities have to synthesize. If you see in the human cycle, right towards the end of the book, there is a very interesting chapter called The End of the Curve of Reason. And this particular chapter ends with a passage which really, which can be quite hard, because he says he's talking in this chapter about many of the ideas we have discussed today. And then he ends by saying that ultimately the solution, the true solution, is a spiritual one. And then these are his words, and I can quote here. He says, "This is a solution to which it may be objected that it puts off the consummation of a better human society to a far-off date in the future evolution of the race. For it means that no machinery invented by the reason can perfect either the individual or the collective man. An inner change is needed in human nature, a change too difficult to be ever effected except by the few. This is not certain, but in any case, if this is not the solution, then there is no solution. If this is not the way, then there is no way for the humankind." So I recognize the importance of what Rod says, that we must be able to discern the difference between different paradigms. And yet I also feel that it's very important to see that the ideal in view is only possible to manifest if these paradigms begin to integrate in some way.
I have to respond to this restatement of the ideal system. Please notice that Sri Aurobindo said that this idea may be understood to put off for a very long time the realization in the world of unity if it depends upon that change of human nature. There is absolutely no point in discussing the problems which exist in the world today if their solution depends only on a change of human nature. We may as well just read philosophy.
No, I think that's the point well taken. Yeah, certainly.
Well, or I can add to it, or we can take that into account, as Rod says, yes, and at the same time try to kind of rise above, as Sri Aurobindo did, and look for all these components, how they play together. We see our views, our approaches as partial or specific approaches to this matter, and see their place and role, and have some other freedom of overview, which allows us to have the sense or the meaning, to get the meaning of this movement, as he beautifully says, that we are not really aware of this grand movement forward. And once we are becoming aware of it in ourselves, we understand how dialectically this search for freedom of individual led us to the equality within society and socialistic systems and domination of state, as he says, that even, and that's why each word has its meaning in Sri Aurobindo. It's very well given, and we are not reading it in that way. We are reading we are finding only what we see. Each individual must have his whole life and action determined for him at every step and in every point from birth to old age by the well-ordered mechanism. Notice this word mechanism of the state. Now, these mechanisms of the state are rising now. You can see them. They are becoming more technological. We can see all kind of credit cards, all kind of regulations, all kind of papers, and electronic registration and electronic following up, and Google knows what you want. It is becoming more and more invasive into our individual life. It is settled there. It's not for bad or for better or for worse, but it is the case. And we can see it, that the state tries to regulate the individual freedom to a certain extent. And that is the end of the age of reason. This is the end. We are at the end of the age of reason and individualist age, and we are looking towards some spiritual or some subjective age, where Sri Aurobindo says in the Human Cycle, without India, without a deeper acknowledgement of inner values, of spiritual values, it cannot be done. So we need a deeper, more profound culture somewhere, which survived for thousands of years and developed certain inner technologies, which will be now taken by humanity to deepen their shallow view on their individuality. And that would be the way towards human unity. And from here we have the nations. Nations are rising. national spirits. Why? There is the whole chapter, the whole proposition in Oslo University for people who would like to write thesis, why nationalistic movements are taking place in the world. They do not understand why nations are rising and nationalistic movements are taking place. And there is a reason for it. There is a need of a deeper or more intimate relations of individual to individual beyond their families. As Sri Aurobindo beautifully speaks about 3 steps of Vishnu. The first step is family, the second is nation, and the third is humanity. So human unity cannot be achieved without the second step in a way. We have to train ourselves within the nation, as you rightly said. Nation allows us to be unifying and diversifying at the same time, where we are safe to express ourselves individually. This is the psychic quality. It's a profound topic, and of course, very interesting to view it from kind of spiritualistic perspective, as it were, not from only where we are today. But then from this point of view, if we look into our topic, we will find a lot of meaning in it. We will find certain intuitions which are helping us to understand what is going on. Okay, with these kind of spiritualistic remarks, I would like to give microphone to Rod to overview his 2 paradigms emerging and why nationalism. It's a very interesting topic, and I hope we will have more time to discuss nationalism today. Yes, Rod. You have to unmute yourself.
No, I'm not muted. Can you hear me? Internationalism is the topic with which Sri Aurobindo ends his work on the ideal of human unity. He does not end with a return to nationalism. At one point towards the end, he says, internationalism is the attempt of the human mind and life to grow out of the national idea, and even in a way to destroy it, in the interest of the larger synthesis of mankind. And since there are some other passages I will refer to with regard to his view of internationalism. But anyway, since he stopped writing in 1950, the real dramatic changes in human society and relations have occurred, far beyond anything that he was able to address at that time. And for one thing, at that time, he was a believer in the possibility of a kind of British Commonwealth empire that would include India. And one of his precautions in that regard was the fact that there were 300 million Indians. Could he have conceived that there would be 1.3 billion Indians in 1950? Or that the world population would double several times, or that all of this great proliferation of humanity on the globe would be united by the internet. It's possible that he could have had an intuition of that development, although it was very, it was still something even science fiction was not trying to address. But there was at that time a conclusion of a kind of nationalistic power, which was defeated in World War I and World War II. And the possibility of the United Nations and of technological development beyond what had been even conceived at that time could have been intuited. And Sri Aurobindo made a comment in the last couple of chapters, in which he said, for nature, and someone used the term nature earlier, as if nature was something with an intention. Most people would not ascribe to that idea, but Sri Aurobindo certainly did. And while defining the state as essentially a political and economic entity that tries to unify through regulation, he said there's another power, nature, for whom or for which there is always an internal necessity in the being. Nature. This is not the spiritual being. This is the being of nature, which has in it an internal necessity to realize through this diversity, these human units, a spirit of freedom and equality and oneness that is tangible. It's not the spiritual one, it's the material one. So he says that nature always has an internal necessity and a will which precedes the outward signals, and in spite of all obstacles, must in the long run inevitably get realized. And if it gets into the common mind of mankind, as the international idea has done, we may count on a more rapid evolution. If the idea of internationalism gets into the mind of mankind as it has done, we may count on a more rapid evolution. So there is this argument that the international idea is itself possible, a possible source of the evolution of something higher than nationalism with regard to human potential, that is not dependent upon that change of human nature, but rather it could facilitate a change of human nature. Internationalism, a kind of global unification on the grounds of economy and politics and science and technology, could in fact be the very transitional structure that nature conceives through the human being as the next stage of evolution, which makes possible that further evolution of the soul. So these two evolutions we have to see are actually going on, and they have an interplay. Obviously, the higher evolution of the human soul imposes upon nature certain improvements in ethics and improvements in health and improvements in law. And at the same time, nature imposes certain limitations on the evolution of the human soul because apparently they are needed. Apparently we can't just go forward with our soul evolution without being slapped around a little bit and pummeled by nature in the form of national differences and economic inequalities, which impose upon us the recognition of a need for unity. If we were not experiencing vast inequalities in wealth and human rights in the world today, how motivated would we be to pursue either an inner or an outer evolution? We might just be satisfied with our superiority to others, and those others might be satisfied with their inferiority because they have no choice. So nature is happily setting up some impossibles for the human species to deal with. And one of the ways that it's attempting to deal with them is through a global organization of science and wealth and economics and law. And so Sri Aurobindo ends with this idea. He says, let us create the framework, any framework, of the aggregate, for she knows already the complete form she intends. Let us have the body. The soul will grow in the body. And in his argument for nationalism, he points out that none of these national units were created without severe opposition from other national units. So perhaps we could perform a kind of analysis of the present situation in which we could understand certain conflicts in the world that are not the same as those that help to create nationalism, but conflicts in the world that help us create internationalism. Because Sri Aurobindo concluded that, in fact, internationalism is a higher form of organization with respect to the expression of the soul of humanity, unity and diversity. And so the struggles of internationalism now are very relevant, though it will be obscure to almost everyone, very relevant to the emergence of a higher human being, a higher way of being human. And so what internationalism currently looks like is a greater sharing and familiarity with different cultures, the world is being unified through cultural interchange. The humanity is being unified through cultural interchange. There is something in political science today, which is actually surprisingly prominent, called soft power. And soft power is the ability of nations to influence each other through music and cinema and art of various kinds. And it has become a very important topic for the United Nations, and there have been conferences recently at Oxford University, sponsored by the United Nations, on soft power. These performances of the human spirit reveal across national boundaries things which are one, the unifying factors of being human. There are many, many expressions of them, of those factors of being human, very diverse expressions, and yet they are expressions of the same thing. And so in the development of globalism, which is another term for internationalism, there's a phenomenon today of growing inequality. And this is the result of unregulated economic growth just since the 1980s. I'm not paying attention to the time, Lemire, so this is a very big topic. You might remind me when I need to wind up. But in any case, the political science today is studying how the process of globalism is creating at the same time unity among those who are mobile in the world and access technology, and a kind of severe sense of inequality among those who are more traditional, who are not so free and not so wealthy. And the governmental entities that are exploiting globalism for the sake of wealth and using soft power as one of their means seem to be rather unconcerned about how those lower down on the spectrum of intelligence and mobility and wealth may be suffering as a result of this growth in power among the human species in its various cultural forms. And so one of the causes in political science today, one of the causes that's being recognized for the resurgence of nationalism is this sense of being overlooked and unrecognized and unsupported on the part of the more traditional national units. So there is this nationalism that is a kind of genuine expression of the need for recognition among a vast segment of the population. And this is something with which globalism has to contend. This vast separation that on the one hand is tending towards a greater unity is also tending towards a greater disparity and disunity. And so this is a problem that the solution of which can be managed by a kind of human intelligence that is more compassionate, more universal, less strictly rational in its adherence to systems, more loving, more inspired. That the solution will not be created by more inequality. And so there are bound to be conflicts in the world of an internal nature with respect to internationalism and globalism that help lead towards a solution to the international problem. And by solving the international problem, the problem of the evolution of the spirit will be enhanced. So nature is giving us this new paradigm that the human species has not had the opportunity to understand very well yet, because it never existed before. There have never been so many human beings on the planet before, with a need to actually unify with other human beings in order to survive. And so all of the perils of globalism and immigration and climate change and COVID-19 reveal to human beings on a global scale their ability to actually look at each other as themselves and solve problems together. It has never been either necessary or possible before. So this debate between nationalism and internationalism is a rather small element of that problem, I think. There are much bigger problems today.
That's wonderful.
And the nationalists, the nationalists have a right to try to turn things backwards. And that's exactly what fascism is. And we see it in America, and we see it in India, and we see it in many countries. And it tends to not recognize the unity of Muslims and Hindus, or the unity of blacks and whites. Native Americans have a right to a greater degree of recognition for the purpose of which they need to block the development of oil export across states, because those things hurt the environment. So these nationalistic movements have their role in revealing conflictual areas, and the solution to those conflicts isn't going to be achieved by the principle of nationalism, and even at its best, it's going to be another principle of global organization that's going to have to solve these problems.
Thank you, Rod. Yes. Truly spoken as true American, so to say, with international spirit, looking at kind of true value of unity. And I was thinking about this for quite some time, when it is most probably this is a new time for us, as you rightly say, and international will add to it the capacity or new new, how to say, views or new perspectives where the soul will find it's more attractive and more learning for itself, how to love its national culture and national spirit. Somewhere in the evening talks, Sri Aurobindo speaks about nations as spiritual shaktis. They are non-evolutionary. They don't evolve. They come and they select certain people, certain land, create culture. These individuals which develop their souls have relations with this spirit Shakti. And as long as there is this connection, as long as there is language, culture, land, it develops these relations with that Shakti. But the moment it disappears, Shakti withdraws to its origin. So basically, this kind of flexible interaction of the national souls, so to say, with individuals is a very mysterious process. And of course, we know nationalism only from the point of view of negative input or deficiencies, and especially with Nazis who introduced it in a totally different and wrong way. But there is also a positive side to it, and efficient nationalism, where the human beings could develop these brotherhood relations or heart-to-heart relations through subtleties of language and culture. It's very difficult to love human beings in general who are not from your culture, whom you do not understand, do not appreciate the subtleties of their language, of their history, of their concerns. So in that way, it becomes more like some kind of fetish or some pretense. I pretend to love others because I must. Yes, it may help humanity to develop and to develop that unity at the end. We are speaking about the final crown, the human unity. But to come to it, we need to grow. We need to be able to really appreciate others and love others. And for that, we have steps on the way. And in that sense, of course, the development of nations, if you look at Europe, United States is totally different topic. There are no nations. It's another kind of experiment of nature, of internationalism in a way. So, but where there are natures and nations, there is something else going on. So we have to see both this and that side. But very, very nice. Thank you for your exposition. It was very beautiful. Yeah, it makes sense. Internationalism is support of the development of the human soul.
We just had a compliment
from
had a compliment from our friend Martha Orton. I had invited her to participate in this discussion. Actually, she is a professor of Sri Aurobindo studies, now living in America. So perhaps in the future she can participate. Thank you for your note. Thank you for your comment.
So, Vladimir, just one point that, so many interesting
please.
ideas that Rod's presentation threw up. One thing is that internationalism is certainly a wider, broader truth than the national identity. And at the same time, I think that it is not necessary that nationalism is identified with the tendencies through which it expressed itself in the middle of the 20th century. So nationalism becomes a bad word around the middle of the 20th century with Nazism and fascism and all of that. And instead of looking at nationalism as having positive and negative aspects, perhaps a better way of thinking of nationalism is to see it as true nationalism and false nationalism. Mm. And this, we can also draw inspiration from Sri Aurobindo's understanding of true subjectivism and false subjectivism in the human cycle. And interestingly, many of the examples that Sri Aurobindo gives about false subjectivism relate to what was happening in Nazi Germany or the developments that led to Nazi Germany. At the same time, when he speaks of subjectivism, as you very rightly pointed out, he speaks of also true subjectivism manifesting itself in the form of the identification with the Shakti of the nation. And so I think nationalism is a topic that you can probably have a session on in itself. I do not think that nationalism and internationalism are necessarily opposed to each other. And I think the point has been made by both of you. But I just want to reiterate that true nationalism is one that can exist and express itself and live in its sense of identity, even while being consciously part of a wider international movement. So there's a text of Sri Aurobindo which I think is so important, the 15th August 1947 message, where he speaks of his 5 dreams. And I think that each of those are, together create the vision of the future that Sri Aurobindo had in view. And when he speaks about the unification of mankind, he says something interesting. He says that it is in the interest of all that union should take place. And he says, when that happens, when the spirit of internationalism manifests itself, he says nationalism will then have fulfilled itself, and international spirit and outlook must grow up, and international forms and institutions, even it may be such developments as dual or multilateral citizenship, and a voluntary fusion of cultures may appear in the process of the change. And then note this following part. He says, and the spirit of nationalism, losing its militancy, may find these things perfectly compatible with the integrity of its own outlook. A new spirit of oneness will take hold of the human race. And this is really, I think, so interesting in Sri Aurobindo's vision, that he does not see these things as dichotomies, but is able to unite them when we can find that place of unity.
I'd like to comment in this respect on Oroville. I lived there for more than 25 years, and one of the prominent features of the Oroville project is something that the mother called the International Zone, in which she invited national groupings or groups, souls, to express themselves, I believe, for the benefit of each other's insight. And it is the one factor of Oroville which hasn't developed very much. It's the most difficult concept for anybody to understand. The idea that the nation soul is one with other nation souls. And that oneness is facilitated through difference. And this is such a difficult concept that we can see a living example of the difficulty of it in Oroville. Those national manifestations of oneness haven't occurred there after 50 years of development. And she had also the same idea in the ashram school, the idea that that different nations would be represented there, which also didn't happen in a formal way. And so, if our more enlightened brothers and sisters can't do it, the possibility of the world growing beyond negative nationalism and experience a kind of renaissance of positive nationalism is a challenge that's perhaps even greater than some of those problems that actually can be solved by a kind of internationalism.
Thank you. Very nice. Could we maybe turn towards the question and answer session? There are 3 questions here which I see. Do you see at the moment a progression of deterioration of the humanity in relation to follow ideals of human unity? The question. Who would like to answer? Do you see deterioration of the humanity in relation to follow ideals of human unity or not?
Oh, well, I see. I see that the ideal of human unity is being furthered by humanity in spite of itself, through science and technology and art and music and the necessity to react to the COVID-19 virus on a global scale. All of these phenomena are bringing out human qualities that are sometimes really astounding. And so even though there appear to be counter movements and conflicts, it seems to me that what's going on in the world today is, if we take pay due attention to Sri Aurobindo's idea of internationalism, we can only see that there is a positive relationship.
Thank you. There are more questions. You can see it yourself here. Yes, if you click on the questions and answers, you can see the questions. And if you like to answer some of them, you please do. There is a request to explore more, but exploration most probably would be quite limited now because of time. Factor spirit, mind, and body, or the spiritual, social, political, and biology of our biological living, so to say, 3 components. I think it's a very broad topic. Exploration of these 3 in the unity. Yes. But if somebody has some insight to speak, please just do. And nationalism has to be, of course, studied separately. We have to have separate, maybe, panel on nationalism. I think it is very valuable now because there are these deficient parts of nationalism, which is more vitalistic and, protective. The nations try to protect themselves, to protect their identities, to protect their countries, and so on and so forth. Misused by politicians for their own sake, and so we see it all the time, all over the world. But the nationalism, one word about Europe, was actually efficiently or positively realized in Europe after Second World War. You can see that European Union, in spite of all the difficulties, has this very new sense of national identities, which does not require borders. And when you move with a car from Germany to France, just crossing the border there is no border, just on the road, now it's France. You could feel the difference of the land. It is tangible. And it's very interesting. They don't need to protect their states anymore because their identity is already fulfilled or realized. And this is something maybe of the future tendency which we can look into. It would be wonderful to explore this possibility. Yes, Devdip.
There's a question by Julian. I think I just have a comment.
Okay.
I think everyone can read the question. Do you want me to read out the question or just answer straight away, Vladimir?
Yeah, you please just few words. Yes, Putin, and it's important. Yes.
Okay, so Julian refers to Schumacher's book "Small is Beautiful," and It says, does Sri Aurobindo state a similar appreciation of scale and balance of self-limitation, especially in the context of all the excesses that are taking place in the world in the field of economics, politics? So I think it's again a very interesting field to look at. When Sri Aurobindo speaks about Indian polity, chapters on Indian polity, there's something interesting that he says that it is these small groups of people which living together, small groups of people living together, which often create the most interesting possibilities for human progress. And so, as opposed to an excessive centralization and excessive uniformity which is imposed from some state or point. And so I think that internationalism is compatible with the idea of lots of small aggregates which are culturally diverse and rich in their expressions. And so I think that this is an idea which is something that, again, we can explore at some point of time. But it's very interesting that human unity should not be confused with the notion of uniformity and similarity. And in that context, these small groups are really important.
I would like to add a historical observation. We've mentioned the negative aspect of nationalism in the 20th century, but as a result of World War I and World War II and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, almost 200 new nations were created. That movement of self-determination that Sri Aurobindo was such a strong proponent of in the beginning of the 20th century became, in fact, the general principle of organization of humanity, self-determination, and through the nation unit. And so, this is a statement of the importance of the small, close-knit cultural entity. That goes without saying, I believe. The problem for humanity now is the global problem, the higher unity. And the balance between the two is a challenge for the human species.
There's also a question by Joshua, and I, of course, agree with him that nationalism does possess a dangerous side to it. And we see its manifestations historically in the last century and also today in different forms. So that is certainly a reality. And at the same time, sometimes this nationalism is also a reaction to a false or an enforced internationalism. That's another challenge, that if your idea of unity becomes to kind of do away with differences, cultural differences, you can certainly expect a reaction. You can certainly expect some form of affirmation of identity when it is being asked to be erased. So, in other words, a false sense of internationalism often leads to a reaffirmation of nationalism. That's another interesting idea that one can look at.
And one more word about what Sri Aurobindo writes about how nations were formed. Nations were formed by expansion, first of all. They expanded into colonies, and then they have to go over their shores, over their borders, and then they fall back into their borders. And once they return into their borders, they are already determined. They become self-aware. And that self-awareness is the best protection. They don't need borders anymore. Only economically and so on, yes, they protect themselves, European Union. But among themselves, they are open because they respect each other's identity It is already inbuilt. It's a new situation with nationalism. If you stay in Norway, for example, you will be surprised that young people, 16 years old, 18 years old, take these costumes, national costumes on National Day. They all come out, play national games. They are happy. It's happiness inbuilt in the nation. It does not require any push, any command from above, any show. It's a need of the soul. They're happy with what they have, with their land, with their costumes, with their culture. They're happy with their language. So it is some new achievement, and this is very valuable for the human unity, this particular realization, because these people can value other nations from now on. When they love their country, they can love others. If you don't love your country, you cannot love others. It doesn't work that way. You have to learn to love other people within your country, your neighbors, first of all, not only within your family, but within your nation. And that is the progress of positive nationalism, or not false nationalism. Yes. By the way, Sri Aurobindo deals with this in The Human Cycle. He shows even Germany in that perspective, that there was a need, a real, true need of the soul, but it was hijacked by the vital ego. It was hijacked by anti-divine forces, so to say, and was turned into just the opposite. Maybe to scare humanity, maybe also to hinder the progress of humanity in the future. That everybody is now scared of nationalism instead of looking at it as a positive movement of the development of the psychic being within individuals, within the group. So it's a big question, and I would like to come back to it one day. So, and internationalism is a higher crown. It's the human unity. It is the last third step of Vishnu. We are all looking for, yes, of course. But to prepare ourselves, we need to grow. Okay, on these remarks, positive remarks, maybe we shall stop today. And thank you, Devdip. Thank you, Rod, for this beautiful interaction. And I hope we will organize something similar in the future.
Thank you for doing it.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for participating. There are more than 57 participants. All the best. See you.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Namaste.